Hello and welcome to this revision video which aims to take you through the Germany 1890 to 1945 GCSE course. This is a summary presentation. It will take you through the whole course, but it won't go into a great deal of depth. It's really useful as something to go through at the beginning of your revision. It will help tell the story, and really importantly, it'll help break down the course into the three big topics, and each of those topics again I break down into individual questions. So it's a way to get a sort of handle on how to revise the whole course. Now you can, I would suggest, as you go through, pause the video every so often to add to your notes. My students will have their mind maps that they can add to, but I think this is a really good thing to do before you start your more detailed revision. And for those of you that don't do an awful lot of revision, perhaps this is a really good thing to do, particularly just before the exam, to really take you over the fundamentals of the course. So what will I do? I'm going to go through three parts of the course, and it'll take an hour or less. You can pause, come back, watch it in parts, however you feel it would be appropriate for you. So the course basically for Germany breaks down into three parts. The first one is Germany from 1890 to 1929, and so we might call that Germany from the rule of the Kaiser before the First World War and during the First World War to the Kaiser's abdication and the creation of the Weimar democracy afterwards. The second part is Germany 1929 to 1934, so it's a shorter period, and this is the period in which Germany suffers from the impact of the worldwide economic depression, and really significantly the Nazis take advantage of this, and we see how the Nazis come to power during this period and then go about destroying the Weimar democracy. And then the last part is all about life under the Nazis from 1934, 33, 34 up until the end of the Second World War in 1945. So that's what I will be taking you through now. 1890 to 1929, from the Kaiser to the Depression, as I've called it there. Now again, what I'm trying to make you think about is what are the big questions in each section. And this will really help when it comes to your revision. I suggest when you're revising, you're thinking about the big questions. I really believe that will help you. So the first big question is, well, what problems did the Kaiser have when he was ruling Germany between 1890 and 1914 to 1918, really the end of the war? The second one is, what problems did the First World War bring? And how did the new government, the Weimar Republic created at the end of the war, how did it try to deal with these problems? How successful was it? And the third one is, after 1923, when you have the key figure of Stresemann in the German government, how far did his government, or the governments he worked in, try to resolve those problems, and how successful they were? So those are the three big questions. Okay, so let's move on. So this first big question then is all about, well, what were the problems faced by the Kaiser? Okay, there he is. He is ruling a country by 1914 with considerable strength. There's no doubt about it. It is a highly industrialised country, Germany, very wealthy. There are wealthy elites and industrialists, highly advanced in many ways. There's an extremely powerful military dominated by the Prussians, of which the Kaiser is one. And the Kaiser is ambitious. He wants Germany to be the preeminent country in Europe. It is already the wealthiest country in Europe, overtaking Britain by 1914 with the largest industrial base. But there are things that the problems the Kaiser faces at this stage. What are they? Well, one, there is a great deal of discontent among the workers that are manning these powerful, important factories producing the iron and steel and coal and armaments. There is growing socialism, and these socialist movements are looking for improved working conditions, better living conditions, and a greater say in the running of Germany. There are demands for more democracy than exists in Germany. And that comes through the Reichstag, the German parliament, where there is a party, the SPD, the Socialist Party, which is leading opposition to the Kaiser's vision of Germany. Now, the Kaiser's vision of Germany is all about powerful military, powerful navy, increasing the size of the empire. But those things are expensive. A series of navy laws are passed to grow the navy, which in one sense is successful, but these are very costly, and the German government is forced to raise taxes and borrow money. And that's very unpopular. So you've got this pull between the ordinary people who want to see improved living conditions and working conditions and greater rights, and then the German elites who are very keen on sort of developing Germany as a great world power. Of course, the one thing that Germany doesn't have as a relatively new country is a large empire, unlike Britain. So again, this is where the German elites are pulling, but the ordinary people are pulling in a different direction. And this is the tension that exists despite the strengths of Germany at the time. So then, of course, we have the First World War, which is not really the focus of our course, but we know, don't we, that the First World War brings enormous problems for Germany. Germany is economically ruined. It goes from this very wealthy country to being a country that is impoverished by the First World War. By 1918, German society is really divided. There are some that have done well out of the war. Factory owners that have fed this armaments industry have done well. But on the other hand, many of the ordinary people haven't done well at all. And the promises made by the war, the early hope, has been utterly destroyed. People feel very let down. There's a split because society has changed in many ways. Men have gone off to war and women have taken their roles, and so there's this pull towards a more modern society, and there's this split between those with maybe more traditional and modern values. And there is a huge amounts of political instability. People angry at the course of the war. Some people angry because they didn't want to see the war come to an end. Some people angry because they felt the war shouldn't have been fought or shouldn't have been fought in the way it was. And so there's a great deal of political anger in Germany at the time. There is disagreement about who to blame for this war. And in this economic and political chaos in 1918, new parties are formed, new extreme parties are formed with extreme ideas, not least the Communist Party, who grow enormously. So there is a new government formed at the end of the First World War, and it faces a number of major problems in its early years, but it survives only just. Now, what are some of these problems? Well, one of the problems is there's this very new form of democracy. There's a sort of very advanced in many ways. It gives women and men the vote on equal terms, for example. Freedom of speech is enshrined in the Constitution. And there's a new voting system, which we would call proportional representation. The problem with this system is that it leads to coalition governments, and at a time when there's lots of problems to solve, these coalition governments don't seem to be able to offer the clear answers that are needed, and these coalitions collapse, and so government begins to be seen as rather weak, democracy begins to be seen as rather weak, and the Reichstag seems to be a place where people argue and squabble rather than where clear decisions are made. Of course, the German government is forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. It is deeply unpopular amongst huge numbers of the German people. They feel it's very unfair. They lose land. They are forced to sign they acknowledge complete guilt for the war, and there are huge reparations bill of 6.6 billion pounds sterling, the equivalent of, is set, which causes many Germans a great deal of resentment against their government and resentment against the foreign powers that have forced this diktat upon them. In this, many Germans long for the pre-war days where things seemed simpler, particularly on the right of German politics. And in this confusion, there are political assassinations, and these extreme political groups on the right and on the left, they can fill this vacuum. And there are a number of uprisings. There are communist uprisings across Germany where they seize control of different cities briefly. Perhaps some of the ones to think about are the famous Spartacist uprising, which happens at the beginning of 1919, the attempt to seize control in Berlin. And then in 1920, the following year, there was a right-wing putsch, which is often referred to as the Cat Putsch, and that was carried out by ex-soldiers who would like a return to the kind of days of the Kaiser. So you get these attempts to overthrow the democratically elected government at this period, and then very famously in 1923, the Nazis try their own, the Munich Putsch. The government survives all of these. None of the opposition groups have enough support to take over the running of the government, but the government only just survives, and it shows the underlying weaknesses. Now, the other major problem which feeds into all the others is these economic problems, and it's one of the most famous things about German history at the time. It is, of course, hyperinflation. Where does hyperinflation come from? What is the cause of hyperinflation? Well, the cause of hyperinflation is initially obviously the impact of the war, which devastates the German economy. But after the war, Germany is forced to pay a huge reparations bill, principally to France and to Belgium, for the damage it has caused in the war, at a time when the German government is already struggling to pay for basic goods and services for its people. Now, the government in 1922 refuses to pay the instalment, saying it's not able to, and in response, French troops and Belgian troops march into the Ruhr, the area on the industrialised area on the western side of Germany, and they attempt to seize control of the means of production and to simply take goods in kind. Now, the government is unable to fight back. Remember, under the Treaty of Versailles, its army has been significantly reduced, and therefore instead it just orders workers to go on strike. Now, to pay those workers, they simply print more money. And if you throw more money into an economy which is really struggling, all you do is you feed the flames of inflation. That money becomes more and more worthless, and the more money that's printed, the more worthless this becomes. People lose the belief in that money. By November 1923, hyperinflation has reached its peak. Prices have reached their absolute peak. Prices have shot up, and money is completely worthless. A loaf of bread costing 200 billion marks. Those with savings are devastated. Those savings are now worthless. So the middle classes particularly are hit very hard. Pensioners are hit very hard on fixed incomes. Businesses are hit very, very hard. And there are those with debts that benefit, but the vast majority of people in Germany suffer enormously during 1922 to 1923. And that's the environment in which Hitler believes he can seize control. And he can't on this occasion. So really things were at their worst by the end of 1922 into 23. But then in the end of 1923 into 1924, you begin to see an improvement. So this is this third section, this third big picture we're talking about, this third big question, I should say. And the man usually associated with this is someone called Gustav Stern. Now, how far does he solve the problems we've talked about? Well, I'm just going to talk about some of the good things. He solves this problem of hyperinflation, introduces a new currency, prices are brought back under control. He begins to start the process of repayments to France and Belgium, so therefore the French leave the Ruhr, and that is a positive thing as well. Not only are the reparations payments lowered under the deals that his government makes, but also he is able to borrow money from America in order to invest in the German economy, the so-called Dawes Plan, and then later the Young Plan, which again reduces reparations. So that helps as well. And Germany's relationships with other countries in Europe begins to be rebuilt. There are a series of treaties signed
which you ought to know about. Something that's also important is that Germany joins the League of Nations in 1926. So it appears as if Germany is being welcomed back into the worldwide community, and votes for extremist parties decrease as a result. So things are looking good by 1928, relatively speaking. And in this period, you get this great blossoming of culture as well, and that's another thing worth knowing, so-called Weimar culture, which particularly blossoms in Berlin. Art, music, and those types of things. However, there are significant underlying weaknesses during this period. Many remain furious at the fact that their savings have been lost. Because of hyperinflation, they remain furious at the having to pay. They remain furious at the Treaty of Versailles, and those things never go away. There is a reliance upon US loans and upon US trade, which is also really, really important. And when disaster strikes America, so it will strike Germany. There's still huge anger at the loss of land and territory because of the war. And those extreme parties, the communists, particularly on the one side, and the National Socialists, the Nazis on the other, they haven't gone away. They may not be doing as well, but they're there. And they are waiting for their moment, particularly those Nazis. And many find the freedoms of Weimar Germany, particularly cultural freedoms, the nightclubs, the jazz music, etc., not to their taste. And they see a Germany they don't like. So there are significant... So now we're moving on to the second part of the course. And the second part of the course is from 1929 to 1934, which is all about the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, and then the destruction of democracy in Germany. The three big questions we will focus on are: what was the impact of the Depression on Germany? How did Hitler become Chancellor? And finally, how did Hitler turn Germany into a dictatorship? So those are the three big questions we're going to focus on. So let's start with the impact of the Wall Street crash on Europe, Germany, and the world. So the economic depression starts off in America, and as the old phrase goes, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And economic depression hits the vast majority of the Western world anyway, and Germany is the hardest hit of the European nations. Germany is very heavily reliant on American loans, as we talked about earlier, and very heavily reliant on trade with America. And when those things dry up, Germany suffers enormously. There is a great deal of social unrest because of this poverty. People are angry. Unemployment levels rise to over 6.5 million by 1932. Significant numbers are reliant on government handouts in order to survive. In this atmosphere, of course, of unemployment, of unhappiness, people look for answers, political answers that they don't appear to be getting in the moderate parties. And the people that benefit specifically are those on the extreme left, the communists, who see some rise in their support. And on the other hand, the right-wing party, particularly the Nazi party, which sees a big jump up in support. These parties promise radical change at a time of extreme hardship. And support for the moderate parties, especially the SPD, which has been the biggest party in the Reichstag since 1919, decline, because they are seen as being not capable of dealing with these problems, and in fact often seen as making them worse through their taxation policies. So why then do people begin to vote for the Nazis, particularly after 1929? Well, you cannot overestimate the importance, or underestimate, the importance of the economic depression in this. In 1928, the Nazi Party have something like 12 deputies in the Reichstag, but it goes up to over 100 in the 1930 elections. This is the fundamental turning point. This
depression gives Hitler a much louder voice. People begin to listen to him in a way they weren't before. People perceive the democratic system, the Weimar democratic system, many people begin to see it as weak and ineffective, particularly since the coalition governing system means that parties argue and squabble and those coalitions collapse. This is also a time, however, where the organisational strengths of the Nazi Party are able to be shown. The many thousands in the SA, the Nazis can call upon them to intimidate opponents, to promote Nazi literature, for etc. And there are also now offices across the country, Nazi offices, which give them a really good political a base from which to promote themselves. We shouldn't, of course, underestimate Hitler's charismatic appeal to the German people as well. And he is able skillfully to make promises to different groups of people, whether that be women, whether that be those in the rural areas, whether that be tapping into the fear of communism amongst the middle classes, whether it be promising work and bread to the poor. And all of this through his skillful speeches. Really important to recognise that the middle classes turn to the Nazis as a solution to the fear that they're feeling. They fear communism, they feel anarchy on the streets. What they want is law and order, and they believe that the Nazis can give it to them. Remember, there's this long-term resentment against the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles still there as well. Now, Hindenberg, who is the president, does not like Hitler, feels he is he's not even German, and he's a sort of a corporal, and he cannot believe that he's risen this far, this fast. However, because the Nazi Party have such electoral success in 1930 and 1932 and then in 1933, it's really difficult for Hindenburg under the Constitution not to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. Now, what he tries to do is appoint other men, and again, I'm just giving you the very broad brush information here, but he tries to appoint others as Chancellor, von Papen, von Schleicher, but none of these have the support in the Reichstag to hold that top job of Chancellor. And in the end, Hindenburg is forced to appoint him as Chancellor in January 1933. Now, what he hopes is that he will be able to control Hitler. He limits the number of Nazis in the cabinet, and with von Papen as deputy, he hopes that this will be the opportunity to control Hitler. Now, he hugely underestimates Hitler's political nous here, and he is also ageing at this point, Hindenburg, and so he's not going to be able to control Hitler. Making him Chancellor ultimately is the death knell for German democracy. So after 1933, this period from 33 to 34, you need to understand that Hitler then goes about destroying democracy. How does he do it? Well, he has some luck. Or is it luck? I mean, there's a lot of debate about the Reichstag fire and who started it. Highly likely to have been started by a Dutch communist. This gives Hitler the opportunity to blame the Communist Party and to then ban them from taking their seats in the 1933 Reichstag. He then passes in March a law known as the Enabling Act, which effectively allows him to pass any laws he likes without consulting the Reichstag. And he does that by making a deal with the Centre Party. Because what's important to remember is, although Hitler and the Nazis are the biggest party in the Reichstag, they never get more than 50% of the votes. So they have to make this deal. Once that deal is passed, effectively the Reichstag is voting itself out of business. He then begins the process of banning trade unions, political parties, and increasing the presence of, and increasing the police state effectively. How does that police state work? We'll come back to it later, but effectively the use of the secret police, the Gestapo and the SS, and we begin to see the use of concentration camps here for political prisoners. 1934, in the summer of 1934, he goes about ensuring that there is no opposition from either within the Nazi Party or even major political figures outside by the so-called Night of the Long Knives. And this is a period of time in which many members of the SA, including Ernst Röhm, who you can see the picture of there, are assassinated, or and other key political figures, including political rivals from the past are assassinated as well. So at this point, in August 1934, Hindenburg dies, Hitler merges the role of president and chancellor, and he's effectively the Führer from this point onwards, and the army therefore declare allegiance to Hitler. By the summer of 1934, Hitler is in complete control of Germany. So that's that next part of the second part of the course completed. So on to the third part of the course, which is about life under the Nazis from 1933-34 up until 1945. What are our big questions we want to address? Well, the first one is, to what extent did the Nazis improve the German economy? It was one of their biggest promises, remember, work and bread. How far did the lives of different groups of people within Nazi Germany change? Women, children, religious and ethnic minorities. And how do the Nazis control this population? Remember, less than 50% have voted for them. How do they go about controlling the population? Through force and fear, but also through censorship and propaganda. So that's where we go now. So let's start with the economic changes. Were they good? Were they bad? Were they both? Well, it rather depended who you were, that's the key thing. So what's really important to bear in mind is the Nazis are very, very keen to reduce unemployment, which is pretty awful, very high when the Nazis come to power. Now, their chosen method for reducing it is to effectively put people into work and fund it with government money. So there are large-scale public works, works carried out, and we can see the picture there, the famous autobahns. Thousands of kilometres are built by unemployed men. Young people are expected to work in the countryside to learn skills and to learn the value of work. And of course, one of the biggest employers is this massive process of rearmament that Germany goes under against the Treaty of Versailles. So huge amounts of money and effort are spent in rearming Germany, and this is a big employer. And of course, really crucially, there's conscription introduced, so lots of young men are taken into the German army for a period of time. All of these things do have the result of reducing unemployment significantly, such that it's negligible by the late 1930s. There almost no unemployment at all. Now, things aren't that simple, as we'll see. There are also some moves made to improve working conditions within factories, and workers are able to earn rewards through the KDF scheme. So that could be holidays, for example. So the idea is that you get people into work and you give them better working conditions and you offer them incentives. And all these things sound good. And it is true that production rises in certain areas, specifically in the area of armaments. But what's really important here is that the economic picture, whilst on the face of it being quite rosy, and people look from other countries and think, wow, it's a sort of miracle, but actually it hides what is a much more complicated picture. Some people, of course, are not counted in the unemployment figures. Women with children, for example, or those just doing part-time work. Workers lose rights fundamentally because trade unions are banned. There is nowhere for workers to go, and in fact pay does not rise for ordinary workers, although there's some rises for those in management positions. So generally workers do not benefit, but there is more employment. It is also true to say that many of these rewards that are promised never materialise. The most famous example is the VW Beetle, which actually is never really mass manufactured for use, although it was much promised. Ultimately, hours are long, and people are expected to work long, hard hours, and those only increase after 1939 when the war begins. And it's the war really that fundamentally is going to undo any progress that's made. It's also worth bearing in mind, of course, and this links to other parts of the course, These benefits are only there if you are a so-called Aryan German, really. So Jewish people, again, not counted in these figures. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that there is this move to try to make Germany self-sufficient. There are very, very ambitious economic plans to make Germany self-sufficient in raw materials, anything from oil to coffee. And so they're an attempt to try to find alternatives. Germany has a very, very successful chemical industry, for example, so there's an attempt to find alternatives to things that Germany would normally need to import. This does not happen. It is not successful, and in the end, of course, Germany is forced, Hitler decides to invade countries in order to take resources from them. Now, what's really significant here, if we're thinking about the economy and society, is of course the war. The German economy booms briefly, largely because it's driven by the armaments industry. And early on, when there are victories in the war, up until 1942, there's a sense that people are willing, or many people are willing, to go along with certain restrictions like rationing, because it appears that the war is going in Germany's favour, and morale is boosted. But what's really important to bear in mind is, particularly after 1942, when the tide turns, Germany suffers more and more, and the people suffer more and more. Not least, of course, because of the bombing campaigns across the city, which leave hundreds of thousands of homeless, many forced to be refugees. And Germany, effectively, many German cities, from Hamburg to famously Dresden, are flattened. And the war has a terribly negative impact on the lives of ordinary Germans. Rationing is very, very severe in almost all areas, and support for the war and support for the Nazis definitely begins to decline as it becomes obvious that the war is going very, very badly, and the German people suffer terribly, first of all through bombing, and then as their countries are occupied, particularly from the east, by the Soviet Union. Now, what about different groups of people? Well, there are significant changes to various groups of people, not least young people. Young people's lives are transformed because Hitler is obsessed with convincing young people of the benefits of the Nazi regime. This process of indoctrination is there because he recognises that a young person is easier to convince, and once convinced, what he imagines is they'll remain a loyal Nazi, totally believing in this project. And he makes speeches in which he says, I don't care if you don't believe in it. I have your children. You know what I mean? They believe in this project. So everything is designed to support Nazi ideology. The school curriculum is changed, and even outside of school, young people are expected to take part in activities that are supportive of this fascist ideology. So young boys are, first of all, it's a voluntary organisation, Hitler Youth, and later becomes a compulsory one, and in it boys are taught particularly really to be trained to be soldiers, and it's one of the reasons the army is so successful early on, is young boys have been trained in military arts from a young age. Now, young girls are taught very differently. There's this very strict dividing line between boys and girls. Boys are taught to be leaders and soldiers, and girls are taught to be housewives and mothers. And so their organisation, the League of German Maidens, is very much focusing on how do you support men in their role. Women themselves are also, there's a great deal of pressure on women to again be housewives and mothers. There's a desire to try to increase the birth rate, so things like abortion are made illegal. There are incentives and rewards for having more and more children, and this idea of Kinder, Kirche, Küche, the 3 Ks, kitchen, church and children, this is supposed to be the focus of women's lives. So professional women aren't allowed to be judges, for example. They will lose their jobs. Now, the birth rate does increase as a result, but it's also true that women are needed for the workplace because the men are at war. So big changes for women and for young people. What about religion? Well, religion's interesting because most Germans would identify at this point as being Christian, majority Protestant, but a very sizable Catholic proportion of the population, particularly in the south. Now, some Christians support the Nazis because they see similar values, traditional values, which they like, and also they fear communism, and they fear that communism will destroy their religion. Many, however, Christians recognise the inherent, the terrible ideas within Nazism and see those as being anti-Christian, particularly the racist ideas or the ideas about strength and weakness in human beings and that kind of idea. So some church groups and some famous individuals stand up and declare that their Christian faith means that they cannot support the Nazis. Martin Niemöller, very famously, is one of those who is arrested. And there are other groups, pacifist groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, Seventh-day Adventists, who are also persecuted because they refuse to support the war efforts and they're sent to concentration camps. So there is the Reich Church, which officially supports the Nazis, and the Catholic Church initially supports, although it soon, when it becomes obvious what the Nazis are doing, particularly in relation to Jewish people, but also generally, they then change the Catholic Church's policy is critical of the Nazis. So there is some opposition, but it is not huge amongst the Christian groups. Now, of course, the groups that suffer most significantly under the Nazis are Jewish people in Germany. About 500,000 Jews in Germany, so a relatively small proportion of the people. Now, the senior Nazis are fanatically obsessed with what they call the Jewish question, what to do about Jewish people, and their discrimination starts almost from day one against Jewish people. Jewish people are discriminated against through a series of laws known as the Nuremberg laws, which are added to and changed over time. And these laws are designed to encourage separation between so-called German citizens and Jews. And they're encouraged, and it's to try, the purpose is to try to develop this sense in the German people that the Jews are not like them. Jewish people lose their jobs. They are eventually forced out of education altogether. And this process of building up this kind of this discrimination through the legal process, through public humiliation, through loss of being able to earn a living, and then after 1938, increasingly violence against Jews is used. Turning point is often seen a night known as the Night of the Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, where Jewish synagogues and homes and businesses are attacked throughout Germany. And what we see from this point onwards is a systematic attempt to go beyond merely using laws to discriminate and trying to force Jews perhaps to leave the country, to rounding up Jewish communities and placing them in so-called ghettos. These are the walled-off areas of towns in which there is very little access to decent food or clean water, in which disease runs rife and many Jewish people die. When the war begins, this process of moving Jewish people into the ghettos continues in Eastern Europe, in cities like Warsaw, etc. But there are also mobile killing squads used to murder Jews as the Nazis move eastwards through Eastern Europe and into Ukraine. Now, it is in 1942 when the so-called final solution decision is taken, and this is to murder all the Jews of Europe. And the means by which this is to be achieved is by building a series of concentration and death camps across Eastern Europe, where Jews will be sent either to be worked to death or to be immediately murdered, and the most famous of these, of course, is Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was both a concentration and a death camp, and in which many hundreds of thousands of Jews died, principally the largest number from Hungary, but from all across Europe. But there were many of these camps spread all across Germany and Eastern Europe. Was there resistance? Well, yes, there was. There was, for example, very famously in Warsaw, there was an uprising in the ghetto there, and there were individual and smaller acts of resistance, but the Jewish population were facing enormous odds against a very mighty military state. It's also true to say that other so-called undesirable groups were persecuted by the Nazis as well. Those who were mentally unwell or physically disabled, and other minority ethnic groups such as Roma and Sinti, and those who were openly homosexual, for example. These were all people that were persecuted and also would have found themselves sent to concentration and death camps. Now, what do the Nazis do to control the population? Well, you've got to kind of recognise that Nazi Germany was a police state, by which we mean that the police and the courts were there to serve the government, not to serve the people. The secret police were known as the Gestapo, and they would spy on people, and really importantly, they ran a network of informers, and so you never really knew who you could trust. And in this, there was a terrible sense of fear that spread across Germany. They worked in conjunction with the SS, who ran the concentration camps and would also round up political opponents and arrest them. And they were greatly feared, and it was the so-called death's head units of the SS that ran these concentration camps. And in these concentration camps, yes, you would find large numbers of Jewish people, but there were also prisoners for other reasons, political prisoners or anyone. Even you could be arrested and even executed for something as minor as telling a joke against the Nazi state. So what were these concentration camps? Well, just to be clear, they were effectively large prison camps where people would be worked with very little food, almost no access to medication, and many people, of course, would die as a result of being there anyway. Even if you didn't, you would come out and you would tell your story, and that would be enough to strike fear into other people. The second thing to bear in mind is that the Nazis had a very, very strong emphasis on propaganda, and they used the media in all sorts of different ways to attempt to brainwash people, and they also censored any information that wasn't supportive of the Nazis. So this combination of propaganda and censorship. The man in charge of this was Goebbels, and he was very, he had an idea famously that, you know, you could lie, and you could, as long as you keep telling the lie and you keep telling the lie, people will eventually believe it. What were some of these ideas that were relentlessly spewed out across various different types of media? Well, the Jews were to blame for Germany's problems. Hitler was a sort of shining knight, as you can see him up there, coming to rescue Germany. That the West and the Jews were in some and communists were working together to try to undermine Germany. These are the sorts of messages, and you would have seen this in posters. You would have seen broadcast speeches, speakers out on the streets even broadcasting Nazi ideas, and for everywhere this swastika. Newspapers, again, tightly controlled. Mass rallies, some of the most impressive and frightening aspects of the Nazi regime, but many people were very, very impressed with these huge rallies that would be held to celebrate and to honour the Nazis and Hitler. And there was a great deal of fear, and people, so there was this combination of fear, but also of propaganda and of controlling information, so that the idea that everything was supportive of the Nazi state. Art and culture too were absolutely part of this. All forms of artwork, whether it be sculpture or painting or literature, had to celebrate Nazi ideas. They used the latest technology, cinema as well, and again films were effectively forms of propaganda that told wonderful tales of German history and German culture and sort of related those to how wonderful things were in Nazi Germany, as the films said, and disguised the real truth. There was also a banning of any books considered un-German, so books by Jewish authors, for example. Modern art, called degenerate, which had flourished in the 1920s in Germany, was taken down out of the galleries. Music that was considered un-German, like jazz, was banned. So everything in terms of art and culture also was used to promote Nazi ideals. Now, did people resist? Well, the truth is, yes, they did, although it was fairly limited. Because some people were very much behind the Nazi regime, others were too frightened to speak up, and others became brainwashed. So opposition might take different forms, and it's true to say that opposition grows as the war continues and it becomes clear that Germany isn't going to win the war. But even grumbling or not giving the salute, the Heil salute, Hitler salute, that could be a form of resistance. So some people would maybe take small forms of resistance. Other people did more active forms of resistance. So that might be something as apparently simple as listening to jazz music, or smoking and drinking, as young people might do, things that the Nazis didn't like, getting into fights with members of the SS. Others did more. So very famously, the White Rose movement, established in Munich by a brother and sister, Hans and Sophie Scholl, they wrote leaflets and distributed them criticising the Nazi regime, and for that they were arrested and executed. There were even attempts on Hitler's life, most famously in July 1944, when a group of soldiers attempted to assassinate Hitler, and they failed on that occasion.